Hello YouTubers, welcome to another episode. Unfortunately, the title is not just some clickbait. I do have COVID. I'm now sort of out of the worst of the symptoms, which I'll be talking about in a minute. But I just want to share my experience with COVID so far, so hopefully it can help you if you do end up getting COVID, kind of to help you prepare for what you might experience, or nothing to do with COVID at all, and you're looking for sort of advice on whether you're ill or not ill, whether you should train or not train, or maybe sort of questions around recovery around illness. But as always, I'm not a doctor, so if you do have any health issues, I definitely recommend reaching out to a healthcare professional. So, my symptoms for COVID for me, and they can kind of vary from individual to individual depending on your vaccination status and all of that, but for me, my symptoms were, I felt pretty bad for a while. There was day one. I was feeling good during the day, and then come night time I ended up getting a bit fevery, and then that night was terrible, shivery, too hot, too cold, and then the next day the fevers eased off a little bit, but then I got really achy, and then that night again fevers picked up, and very cold, very hot, again not ideal. And then the next day started easing off and kind of has been easing off since. So the big symptoms for me lasted about 3 days, but again, this can be very variable for anyone. You could end up with nothing, you could end up with much worse. It's just kind of a little gauge of what you might experience, but definitely would not recommend. I also want to talk about sort of the testing that I've been doing. So I was a close contact with a family member. They visited for the holidays, who initially they were testing negative on their lateral flow tests. But then while they were visiting, they tested positive on their lateral flow tests. So what's really interesting, kind of, is I was continuing to take the lateral flow tests. I had about 4 or 5 lateral flow tests and PCR tests, which all came back negative until I started developing symptoms. So then I thought, okay, I'll go get another PCR test, continue with the lateral flow tests. So I ended up taking about 8 lateral flow tests, which all came back negative until this one, a positive lateral flow test. Hopefully that focuses in, maybe. And which is just 2 lines instead of the 1 line. And my PCR test came back positive. So what can be really difficult is, well, if it's coming back negative, does that mean that you don't trust a negative test? I'm not going to argue about the accuracy of the test at all, but I just want to sort of highlight that just because they were negative and just because you might be testing negative doesn't mean that you're safe to be, for example, visiting family or someone who may be vulnerable. I think you have to really be honest with yourself if you have a little bit of symptoms and you're thinking, I feel okay, but my test is negative, so I'm fine. If you have symptoms, regardless of the illness that it is, especially when you're going into training side of things, it can affect you. For example, I did my 5K a couple of weeks ago now, and I was really ready to go faster than the time came out, and I was questioning my heart rate and all that stuff, and now it kind of makes sense. My body was already starting to fight off COVID as I was doing that 5K, and even just fighting off little infections, not big ones, can have an effect on your body and your training. So sometimes, in fact, the majority of the time, even if you have the sniffles or a sore throat or whatever it is, it's better in the long run especially to take a day or an extra day to make sure that that's not going to get any worse. If you have a little bit of a sniffle and take a day off and then go back to training without a sniffle, it's just a day off, you should be okay. But if you end up taking a day off with just a sniffle and then the next day it gets even worse, then you're going to be really glad you took that first day off, because that would have been even worse if you were training. So hopefully that makes sense. And so that's kind of my outlook on illnesses when you're training, is that if you basically to take the day of rest if you're feeling at all under the weather. But sometimes you don't feel under the weather and you're underperforming, and how do you know that you're ill without actually feeling ill. And that's where an interesting measure that you can look at for your individual self that could help you sort of, okay, maybe today is a day I should stop training because something's not right, but I don't know what that is yet. And that is taking your resting heart rate and then getting an idea of what your resting heart rate normally is. And so when your resting heart rate ends up going up and up and up, you know something's not right. When your body is stressed, whether it's just trying to recover from training or maybe you've had a bad night's sleep, it will go up. But when you're getting ill, it will also go up as well. It's fine for your resting heart rate to increase, but to increase 15 plus from where it normally is, that's when you have to start questioning, okay, something's not right here, I should really take some time off and rest. And even just talking to your coach about it and saying, look, my resting heart rate's way off, I'm feeling okay, but I know something's not right. Because generally when you're feeling okay, but your heart rate is way up, within a short period of time, for me anyway, generally you're going to get ill very soon. And now to the sort of last sort of questions of, should you train when you're ill, should you not train when you're ill, and sort of recovery time with illnesses. And should you train when you're ill? No, there's not really much point, because even if it's a small illness, it's an additional stress on the body that your body doesn't need. And again, that if you took a little bit of a rest day, whether it's a day or maybe a couple of days, you're going to be better off in the long run, where if you train when you're ill, you can be much more likely to overdo things and make that illness much worse and taking even longer time off. How long should you take off if you're ill? Well, again, that can depend on the illness itself. For me, I look at my resting heart rate. When that goes back down to normal, that's a good sign, but doesn't automatically mean you're good to train. Right now, my resting heart rate's very close to normal now, but my symptoms of COVID are still there. So a bit breathless and a little bit achy, but not too bad. So basically, I'm waiting until the symptoms to completely disappear and my heart rate to be normal as well. And that pretty much applies to any illness. If you have any symptoms that are lingering, just rest, unfortunately, until they disappear. And lastly, recovery time for illness. How long should you take before you start training? How should training look when you do start training? Well, it's all about, you can't just start from where you left off. Obviously, it depends on the length of time you've had off. It's been a really bad illness, you've had maybe a few weeks off, then you're going to have to start a lot slower than you would maybe if you had a couple of days. But you really have to listen to your body again. If you feel good, resting heart rate's normal, no symptoms, you're ready to go, you go back to training and your resting heart rate spikes again and you're all over the shop and you're feeling ill, then you've probably started at too high of a level, and it's just about a case of building back up into it. And the positive thing about building back into it is that it won't take too long, because your body generally, when you've reached a certain fitness level or a certain strength, it's much easier to get back to that level than if you're trying to get to a new level, if that makes sense. So that is the hopefully not too waffly video about sort of illness and training and my COVID experience. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. Again, I'm not a doctor, so if you do have any really specific health questions, reach out to your healthcare professional. But if you do have any other questions related to training, etc., definitely I'll try and help in the comments below if you do have any. And as always, Yam Squad, remember to subscribe if you haven't already. So hopefully when I do recover from COVID, we get back to training, back to smashing it, and we'll see about that 5K as well, if we can improve that once I'm actually not ill. And I will see you in the next episode.